Good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good, good. Okay, I know some people are filtering in and out, getting coffee, doing their thing. So we're just going to get started because I know the whole day is running a little bit behind. We'll just get started with what we're going to do today. I'm John Foley. I'm the Executive Director of Project Drawdown. We're the world's leading resource for climate solutions. And lately, we've been thinking a lot about how we deploy money, capital, investments, philanthropy, government funding, and things like that to climate solutions to make sure we're kind of shortening the distance between the resources we need and the solutions that are out there, and make sure we're deploying money, time, and effort in the most efficient and most strategic ways possible. So this panel today is really going to be diving deep into the question of, how do we deploy our resources, our finite money, time, and effort to really address climate change in the most effective way possible. And we have a killer panel for you today, like unbelievable. We're so lucky today to have these smart people with us. So thank you for joining us today to talk about this. Also, I'm going to do a little plug before we introduce the panel. Project Drawdown is also starting up a new effort soon, which we'll put up a slide at the end where you can kind of learn more about it, and there'll be handouts in the back. We're creating something called the Drawdown Labs Capital Accelerator. It's really meant to be kind of an educational program and a community building program to connect scientists who work on climate solutions and educators and others, along with investors and philanthropists, to kind of build a community that's learning together how to really deploy money and resources in the most effective way towards climate solutions. So stay tuned for that, the Drawdown's Capital Accelerator. Woohoo, okay. Thank you. I don't know who that is, I can't see. So anyway, I appreciate that, whatever that was. That was great. So why don't we go ahead and, instead of me introducing the panel, they are so smart, you want to hear from them, not from me. So I'm going to just ask them to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll turn it over to some questions. And then I believe there'll be a QR code somewhere on the screen a little bit later where you can maybe text a question. And I've got this fancy, cool iPad thing where later on, when we get to kind of audience Q&A, you can text me a question, and I can read it out, and we'll go from there. But let's turn it over to the panel. I'm so excited about this. And why don't we just start with you, Melissa?
All right, hi everyone. My name is Melissa Ewell. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Elemental Accelerator. Elemental is a global nonprofit investor focused on scaling climate technologies with deep community impact. We have a pretty large portfolio, 150 companies. We've been at it for about Baker's dozen years, about 13. Our companies are active across all 50 states and globally. They've also raised about $8 billion in follow-on funding, so they're doing well. That's it.
Great. Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Stefan Nicolo. I'm a general partner at Full Cycle. So we're investing in climate tech companies and their infrastructure projects. It's an investment thesis focused on the highest impact greenhouse gases. We're really focused on getting the intersection of efficacy and financial returns right, and then demonstrating that for the market. I am also on the board of Project Drawdown, and so focus on, of course, the larger subset of solutions beyond that which is investable, and generally put my mind to work on thinking about the intersection of policy, innovation, and capital.
And I thought yesterday somebody said you were the methane guy.
I have been described as a methane guy. I hope it's for the right reasons.
We have a solution for that.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Berlow. I'm the CEO of Vibrant Data Labs, and we're a social mission data science company trying to build open source tools to improve the effectiveness of how money flows to climate. And right now we're building an open source framework for synthesizing all the money going to climate solutions right now in the United States, private investments, philanthropy, and so everybody can just see a big picture of who is already funding what, and trying to shine a light on where are the gaps that are high impact.
Hi, I'm Ramez Nam. I've been in climate since about 2009, 14 years now. Cut my teeth as a forecaster, looking at the exponential cost declines to come in technologies like solar and batteries. I'm a climate tech investor at Planetary Venture Capital, an advisor to XPRIZE, and constantly looking for both ways to invest private capital and philanthropic capital to make an impact.
Okay, great. Well, again, we have an amazing panel here. And so why don't we just start with a kind of a basic question. The world is getting serious about climate change, finally. Now, numerous sites are reporting that the first trillion, maybe $1.5 trillion have been spent now by the world towards climate solutions. Not nearly enough, but it's, it's getting interesting now, and things are getting really, really kind of cool on the climate investing front. And but the question is, how best to deploy that capital? Like, how do we make sure that the money's going to the most effective solutions, the things that are going to move the needle the fastest, the best way, the most equitable way, and so on? Huge question. But I'd love to hear from each of you. You each work in different organizations that think about this really hard. And maybe what is your kind of top line philosophy of, what's your theory of change? What's your theory of investing in climate solutions in just a few sentences? And maybe we'd love to hear from all four of you.
Sure, I can kick us off. So at Elemental, our theory of change is that while technology might have half the solution, community has the other half. And that shows up in the way we work in a couple of ways. First off, our portfolio is about 50% represented by founders and leadership teams that come from traditionally excluded backgrounds. So that's across race and gender. And then the other part of that is that more than half of our portfolio are serving low to moderate income communities or frontline communities. And that's something that we first source for, but we also coach our companies how to do. So practically, we rely a lot on community input in terms of how we look for technology solutions, and then before we make any investment decision, we convene what's called a community marketplace. It's kind of like a community investment committee. And so we'll pressure test a solution. We'll really look for what pain points a community is feeling. We used to use this term called place-based innovation, so really trying to source technologies that are serving a particular need in a place, and we take that really seriously. So technology as half, community as half, and a lot of this is not exactly kind of second nature for companies. So we have a whole curriculum around training our startups about how to do this. We have something called the Square Partnerships Toolkit, which trains companies about how to first listen to communities before they then design their solution in order to meet the specific needs. And then we have community benefits plans baked into all of our deployments.
Really important framework and thinking. I'll pick up from that. We share a very similar ethos and mindset. For us, when we were crafting the investment thesis for Full Cycle many years ago, it became apparent that we're going to need capital to accelerate beyond the technological development and actually get into the game of building infrastructure. Right? Everything has to be overhauled for a low carbon transition. Our systems of power, energy, waste, water, and so that's infrastructure build out. And what you typically see in this sector is not one, but two valleys of death. Our sector is very dramatic. But that second valley of death happened. The first one is, will the technology work? But the second one is, can you actually get beyond a pilot or demonstration of that technology to the point where it's fully commercialized? And so part of our approach is to say, okay, what is stopping that transition from happening? Why is it the case that so many companies actually do die on the vine after they've spent a lot of time and a lot of money building a first of a kind or building a pilot project? And part of that is the financing needed to get to that commercial demonstration is actually significantly more than what you would need to build a pilot. Sometimes you're talking about a 5 to 10x scale up of the size of the infrastructure. And so companies typically have to go around, raise capital, significantly more capital than they're actually worth, right? So you might have a $25 million company having to raise $100 million to build one plant. So that was a problem that was thwarting a lot of companies. And what we said is, well, when we invest in companies, what if we established rights of first refusal to actually build with them their pipeline of projects? So that means we're your capital partner for projects 1 through 20. By the time you get to 20 projects, the largest corporates in the world, your off-takers, our municipalities, you're in a different ballgame. And we hope to smooth that path and actually bridge that valley of death. So it's thinking about the nuts and bolts about how we actually transition our infrastructure that led us to the strategy and helped us devise something that can be in both support of companies and accelerate the deployment of all the clean technologies we need to operate in our economy.
That's great. Yeah, my approach to, or our approach to thinking about impact is, I'm an ecologist by training and have done a lot of work on complex systems. So I think about collective impact on how to solve a very complex problem. And the key framework is really simple that comes out of it is just mind the gaps. And so Stefan just outlined one critical gap in the funding food chain that our approach is to try to then leverage the data to evaluate, is that impact thesis? And we did some work looking at the survival of companies through the phases of their life as a startup, and found that companies that had an early grant or an early loan, in early stages, were 3 times as likely to make it to post-venture and collectively raise 5 times as much money than you'd expect by chance. And so trying to use some data science to just evaluate those, to put some meat to, behind them. But the simple framework about finding the gaps is like, imagine you are in a community trying to grow a tree. The tree needs sun and water, nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. And if you were just thinking about individual impact, you could fund the water company because trees need water. They're watering trees, they're doing great, done. But if we only water the tree, it'll die. And so if phosphorus is missing, it will die. If any one thing is missing, it'll die. And that's the kind of problem we face, is that there's a lot of solutions that need to happen. And if any one is missing, we lose. And so the simple answer is that everybody needs to know what it's getting and what it's not in order to know where to contribute. So that's kind of our focus on how do we just follow the money to what's getting funded and what's not, so we can shine a light on the gaps. That's the main thing. And we're following the money, and what I find fascinating is that then you need to compare that to what are the needs, and that's what Project Drawdown and others are doing, is like defining what are the needs, and so we need to just marry the two together.
Great answer. I like all of these answers. Just to come back to what John was saying, total spending per year now on climate tech is between $1.1 and $1.4 trillion. 2022 is the first year where that spending on clean energy technologies was larger than spending on fossil fuel extraction. Spending on solar in 2022 was larger than spending on oil extraction. So we've come a long way, and the doubling time is about every 4 years. But something to understand is almost all of that is commercial capital. Almost all of that is debt financing or project financing for technologies that are mature. Solar, wind, electric vehicles, and batteries are basically the bulk of that. All venture capital is maybe 3 or 4% of all climate funding. So VC gets a lot of attention. It's actually very small. And when you add philanthropic dollars, you're still in a very, very small segment. So when I think about it, I think a lot like Eric. I think about what are the unsolved problems? What are the things that no one is solving yet, the things that can't get commercial capital? That's where I think I can have a lever to help make those things move into a category. On the philanthropic side, it's even more true where that there's severe gaps, because private capital that's seeking profit only invests in things that might have a profitable return. But there's a host of things we have to do for the planet that don't have an obvious business model. So when I think about the biggest levers for philanthropic capital, it's what are the things where it's a pure externality or where there's no rich nation that cares about this topic. That's where I think the biggest lever for those philanthropic dollars is.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. That's something that we think a lot about at Drawdown too. Is like you have kind of what we call like a capital stack, is a word you hear a lot in this space of different flavors of money that do different kinds of things: philanthropy, venture, public money, ESG funding, whatever. But then you have a carbon stack as well. You have all the different things that are emitting greenhouse gases on different timescales, different industries, different sectors. How do you cross those two things? How do you optimize the deployment of money to the right kind of part of the carbon stack? Knowing different kinds of problems need different kinds of investments, either expecting returns or not. And really, really thinking hard about that is kind of new. I think that we've just been kind of finding where it works, but we really need to be more deliberate about that. Maybe a follow-on question to that too is like one of the things we think a lot about is how a lot of people kind of forget this, but climate change is a cumulative problem. The temperatures we see on Earth today reflect the last 100 years of emissions, not this year's emissions. Climate solutions work the same way. They're cumulative between now and getting to the Paris Accord. So what we do, it isn't how many gigatons per year, it's also how many years were you doing it. So that's why early solutions matter a lot, because they keep on working for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Whereas the longer you wait to deploy a solution, the less time it has to kind of do work on the atmosphere. So just like there's a time value of money, there's a time value of carbon as well. And you can apply a discount rate to climate solutions. The longer you wait for them, the less effective they're going to be. Just like saving for retirement. The longer you wait, the less money you're going to have. So with that in mind, we kind of talk a lot about what we call like emergency brake solutions, things you could deploy like right now that have a disproportionately fast deployment cycle that can get out there and do work in the atmosphere to kind of buy time to help bend the curve while other things need to mature. We need kind of a, almost like a relay race where you're passing the baton from one runner to the next, to the next, to the next. And how can we think about that? Where would you all go, in whatever order you want, for like emergency brakes? How do we hit the brakes on this thing, especially after this summer, which oh my God, it seems like the problems are accelerating. That means we need to really accelerate the solutions big time. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Yeah,
I think I have the most controversial answer, so I'll toss it out there.
Oh yeah, I know.
So when I started in climate, we thought we were headed for 5 or 6 degrees Celsius of warming. And that was truly a threat to civilization, like existential threat to civilization. We've bent that curve. Just because of the cost declines we've seen in solar and batteries and so on, now it's maybe 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees C, something like that. Opinions differ. There's a raft of papers in the last 24 months saying that. What we're not on path to achieve is to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there is a substantial difference. There are tipping points like all shallow water coral reefs might enter terminal decline at 1.5 C. So when I think about what is the most underfunded solution in climate tech and where could we have most of the emergency brake, it is what we call geoengineering. It is sunlight reflection technology, whether it's brightening clouds or putting aerosols in the stratosphere. I'm not proposing that we deploy this today, but if you want an actual emergency brake, this is something where, I told you $1 trillion in climate tech, it's about $10 million of annual funding goes into all study of this field. So there's questions that we can't answer today. And if we want to have the ability, if tipping points go faster than we think, or we get into really, really dire situations, I think at least funding sort of non-invasive additional research in that area. And I'm a humble man. I don't want a lot of money for it. I just think instead of $10 million, it should be $1 billion a year. $1 billion isn't very much, actually, in the scope of these things. And that's sort of a joke for you all. But that's the scale at which we would be evaluating something that has more power to slam the brakes on warming than anything else that we know of.
Interesting. So let's stick a pin in that for a second.
Yeah.
But to address the question, so I can see an eye roll or two, here goes the methane guy. But actually, the opportunity to mitigate methane emissions and bend the curve more than we have already done so is low-hanging fruit that we shouldn't leave off the table. So part of what that means is understanding where are the stocks, right? Where does methane come from, both anthropogenically and in nature? So a couple of things. One, methane comes from 3 to 4 key industries: waste, agriculture, and the extraction and kind of leaks in the oil and gas infrastructure. All of the solutions for those 3 areas are low tech, are available, are oftentimes negative costs, meaning they actually make money when you make money on savings. And so this is a no-brainer where if we focus our attention and get serious about deploying capital into those very low-tech solutions, we can have a material impact in the very near term. I think you started the question talking about, it was the hottest summer we've experienced. Part of the reason we're experiencing something different than the data is telling us is because most of the data we look at looks at what happens to a methane molecule in the atmosphere over 100 years. But the reality is that's not an accurate snapshot of the emissions and the effects that they're having, right? You shrink that down to a 20-year basis, and suddenly methane is 80 to 86 times more heat trapping than CO2. This is now something with which we are getting comfortable and familiar, but 3 or 4 years ago, the methane guy walked into the room and no one even knew what I was talking about. So, we've come a long way to identify that this is one of the key levers. It's obviously one of the emergency brakes that we talk about at Project Drawdown. But you can design an investment thesis mitigating methane because all of the ways in which you do so yields value in a commercial setting in our economy. People will pay you for materials or fuels or pay you to take waste away and not let it degrade in a landfill that will emit methane in abundance. And so there's this opportunity set here that's really important for us to understand before we get to the really exciting Star Trek stuff that's in the lab appropriately. And I do agree with scaling up that funding. We've got to get good at just blocking and tackling for the things that are really achievable for us, and we'll have big economies for the output or the savings that we generate by virtue of doing that work.
I just want to add about methane too, okay, former professor, sorry, I'm gonna nerd out a little second. We have to take methane a lot more seriously, as Stefan was saying too, because right now, this year's emissions of greenhouse gases, the methane we emitted this year is gonna warm the planet more than CO2 will for at least the next 15 to 20 years. We often don't appreciate that. And about a third of the warming we've seen so far is due to methane. And we've been kind of artificially discounting it in all the IPCC reports, and it's the fastest acting lever we have outside of solar geoengineering, period. And yet it's not talked about nearly enough. So that's just physics. And I think we've done a real disservice to helping people understand where the levers are in the climate system by kind of lumping CO2 and methane on a 100-year equivalent. But we're all living 1 year at a time, in real time, in a rapidly changing planet. In the transients, methane is actually more important. Long term, 1,000 years from now, CO2 will win. But right now, it's methane. So we have to think about a lot of these different things a little differently than we have. But anyway, sorry to nerd out, but couldn't help myself. Maybe I'll jump into a couple more questions, and then we'll turn it over to some Q&A and a little bit more too from the audience. But a lot of you talked about, climate solutions cannot and must not stand alone. We're not just trying to fix the sky, right? We can't think of climate change in just some bubble without paying attention to human well-being and equity and justice in a world that is very complex and very, very, rapidly changing. And we have aspirations for a much better world than just fixing a problem, I hope. So we have ways of improving human well-being. We have climate change. We also have nature itself and the intrinsic kind of biodiversity and ecology of our world. How do we begin to think more holistically across that span of kind of nature and people and climate, not as separate problems, but really one problem where we're not just fixing something, hopefully we're building something a lot better than we've ever seen. I know a lot of you share that kind of perspective, but how do you think about that in your daily work, and any tips for us to kind of take that broader view without getting too lost in it? Melissa, I think you wanted to go for it?
Yeah, sure. The way we think about it at Elemental is always looking for, co-benefits from the technology solutions. One of my favorites in the space recently is one of our portfolio companies called Forum, and they are electrifying the drayage sector of, goods distribution. And drayage, for those of you who don't know, is this really critical period from when a thing that travels to a port on a ship, gets taken off the ship, and gets taken to a distribution center. And it's a highly, highly trafficked route. It's really dirty, and a lot of low or moderate income communities are situated nearby. So you have a lot of negative health impacts and climate burden on this population. So the state of California is actually passed a mandate that drayage needs to be zero emissions in the next few years. And why that's exciting but also challenging is a lot of the folks who run those routes are small business owners. So it's just a single person owns a truck. And to electrify that and create a charging network for this kind of future is really expensive. And you could see a world where a big company who has a big balance sheet is able to take that all. And so what Forum is doing is they're actually creating a network and a fleet of electric drayage trucks and creating a mechanism for these small business owners to either eventually own or lease these trucks. And so the co-benefits there are a healthier sort of port and a route network, but also preserved livelihoods and hopefully elevated livelihoods for folks who are serving that purpose.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that too. My understanding is that if we want to transition 100% of everybody to renewable energy and mobility, that means that 100% of the people need access to it. So building tech just for the rich and hope 1% doesn't really work. And so to me, the question of social equity isn't just a moral thing to do; it's actually the answer. So I don't think I think they're just laid on top of each other. It's the center of the solution. Similarly, nature is our life support system, and it's the cheapest way to capture and store carbon by far, way more than any technologies. And the only way to protect and restore nature is if the livelihoods of those on the ground, those communities, are actually improved by it, and that the the forest is more valuable alive than dead. And one of the quickest emergency breaks that we have is to stop deforestation and also improve the health of forests that are at risk, high risk of just going up, in black carbon and flames. And so, but all of those only work if the communities on the ground are also, their livelihoods are improved. Just like putting a fence around it doesn't work. And so, to me, the triple crises of climate, biodiversity, and social inequity are like, this is our chance to solve them all at once. It's actually not a moral thing to do. It's the only way to do it.
Yeah. It's probably also worth noting, our natural systems, nature generally, has done the best job for the eternity of this planet sequestering carbon, more so than technology ever could or ever will. So protecting and stewarding nature is the best way to protect that ability to do it. You mentioned biodiversity. It's about 5% of our global population that is responsible by virtue of the land that these folks steward for protecting about 90% of our biodiversity. So that's a huge lever of both making sure we have healthy ecosystems and making sure we're in service of people by doing the right work to manage land, to restore our ecosystems and make sure that we're not destroying them by deforesting.
Yeah, I think like 75% about of high carbon storage ecosystems are on indigenous lands, and they comprise 80% of terrestrial biodiversity, I think. So it's like indigenous land tenure is actually the answer. It's not just a nice thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to underline that a little bit. Just I think a lot of people don't quite appreciate that deforestation today is estimated to be about 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 11%. That's almost exactly the same number as the entire United States economy emissions, 11%. And one is US economy emissions are going down. Deforestation lately has been going up. They just crisscrossed last year. That's astonishing. How much attention does the world media spend on the US emissions versus deforestation? Like 100 to 1. Okay, so deforestation, I'm not saying ignore the US, don't do that. But deforestation is a really big deal, and I'd love to see a lot more attention to that because it's also about human well-being, especially a lot of some small community numbers, but who have incredible resources, who have been really, really unfairly treated a lot in world history. So I think we have a lot to do there for human well-being, but also for biodiversity, for watersheds, also selfishly for zoonotic disease and so many other things. The rainforests really are kind of the emergency brake of emergency brakes, along with methane in a lot of ways too, I think. But yeah, really.
I'll add just two quick thoughts on this. I think this illustrates that technology and investment and capital are not always the whole solution. It's policy. Right? Policy, like we've seen in Brazil, suddenly deforestation started to drop under the new administration. That matters tremendously. And the second is, unfortunately, we have carbon markets. We have carbon markets for nature. Those are under a lot of negative press right now and are being pressed down. We lack effective biodiversity markets. If you are preserving a forest or planting a forest, you can get paid for the carbon content, but the fact that it provides a habitat for animals or creates precipitation nearby is not something we effectively can monetize today in a scalable way. And that problem is an opportunity. Somebody who solves that can unlock, I think, a tremendous amount of capital to flow to preserving and restoring these ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, the only opportunity to benefit from that is when there's commodities that come out of the forest. And right now, I mean, that's where there's an interesting intersection with tech where I know some work in Suriname where it is more profitable to cut the forest down and mine for gold than it is to keep it alive. And part of it is because you could protect the forest and harvest Brazil nuts and other nuts and get the oils and sell them to cosmetic companies. But the value chain along the way extracts too much of the profit so that the community on the ground doesn't get much and it's not worth it, right? But technology that helps them get paid directly by the cosmetic company at the end, suddenly it's profit. It's like, oh, now we're actually making enough money that we'd rather do this than mine for gold. And it actually works, but it's just simple technology to more efficiently directly pay the communities on the ground. So I feel like there's a room there for, it's like boring technology, but that's enabling to actually get over the hump so that it flips the economics of it.
That's a great example.
Yeah. Love that. I'm going to ask one last question. In the meantime, I'm getting some questions trickling in. There is a QR code, I think, over my left shoulder, I think, right? Yeah, okay. If you hold your phone up to it and take a photo of it or something, it'll get you to a link where you can text me a question. Some of you have already done that, but if you want to ask a question, that's how they want us to do that. So please send some more in. But I'll ask one last one for me. Okay, imagine you have $100 billion, and I ask you to figure out how to cut emissions as much as humanly possible, or net carbon emissions as much as humanly possible between now and 2030. Go. Where do you put the money?
Yeah. Well, I'll
One
start with that.
sentence.
I'll put it, everywhere, at once. But the main thing is like I put it in really being able to see the big picture all the time of where it's going, so that everybody can see where the gaps are. Because what's the most important is going to depend on what's missing at that moment. So that's going to be key.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would look at Eric's climate finance tracker, and then I would say we need more full cycles. So at Elemental, we've really been leaning into what we call the scale gap, because it's real. It's not just a gap, it's a chasm. We're very dramatic, yeah. It's like a third valley of death. But I mean, you mentioned we have over $1 trillion, but we need $4 trillion per year. And a lot of what's holding that back is there's sufficient early stage capital. We've been really good at focusing on that. There's debt on the other side. But when a company goes from being venture-backed to raising their first project finance facility, that is a long road, and there's not enough capital in that gap. And so I would have a fund that focuses there with innovative tools around insurance and first loss. It's probably somewhat philanthropic, but hopefully there are some returns when you hang on. And the other thing, though, that I'd add is it's not just capital, but it's also capacity building. And so I think there's a lot to do around equipping, entrepreneurs and developers with some policy expertise, some community partnership expertise. And then the last thing I would say is I would put some of that money towards storytelling. If a project happens in a forest and no one hears about it, did it really happen? For some it did, but there's so much value that I think we leave on the table if we don't talk about the projects that are really making a difference. Folks can learn from them. Folks can adopt them in their own, communities and maybe make tweaks so that it matches what they need. But I think storytelling is really a place where there's outsized impact as well.
I'll give 3 really quick answers. The first is the solar radiation management that I mentioned, and I totally agree on methane, by the way, and soot and other things. But one thing people don't know is we're sort of doing anti-geoengineering right now. The International Maritime Organization phased in new rules that reduce sulfur emissions from ships, which is awesome for air quality and health, but it means that we are reducing a solar shield that was previously reflecting sunlight back into space. James Hansen, the father of climate change, believes we're seeing substantial rebound warming because of that. So that's one. You heard me on that already. 2, politics. We passed the IRA by 1 vote. When people ask me what can they do personally, it's elect leaders that take climate change seriously and will act. And 3, if there's one policy area that we haven't addressed here in the US, it's permitting. We have these massive incentives to build renewables. We cannot get transmission lines built. We often can't get wind farms built. So solving that permitting issue is now, Jesse Jenkins at Princeton estimates that if we don't increase the pace at which we're building interstate transmission, 80% of the IRA's benefits on carbon emissions will not be realized. So that's the most pragmatic issue that I'm passionate about right now.
Yeah. Fill the gap.
Yeah.
Fill the gap, mind
It's
the gap.
really, the connectivity gap is huge, yeah.
I'd say brilliant answers. I wouldn't say it any differently. Obviously, nature, methane are big pieces. But what I would say is, the question really is, how does $100 billion galvanize trillions of dollars? And I think part of that is understanding, amidst all the solutions that fit into those buckets, where are the commercial opportunities to scale these companies as fast as possible? How do they work with the largest corporations in the world or feed into those value chains so that they become the new companies that generate power without emitting carbon or recycle our waste perfectly and recycle those molecules in perpetuity? That's going to be the challenge ahead, is how do we bring companies forth that replace and eclipse the aging 19th and 20th century companies and infrastructure that did fine to get us here, but are obviously no longer serving us. So, it's great to build one thing of a project, but you've got to be able to scale and build thousands of those examples of that technology for it to make a meaningful impact. So there's a crisscross here where you've got to find the ways in which it plugs into economies that exist and gives us an opportunity to scale.
Great. Well, I've got a whole bunch of questions in here, so I'm going to reword some of them into just aggregating. I can't possibly ask all of them. There are like 40 questions in here, it looks like. You all been busy. Two kind of themes that keep on popping up, though, is, again, this idea of like the capital stack, different kinds of resources and different kinds of teams focusing on different kinds of solutions. How do we balance the kind of low-tech and maybe nature and political solutions with the industrial solutions and high-tech solutions we need? What's the best way to kind of build that larger portfolio? And there's a bit of a gravitational pull for like venture folks tend to like the high-tech, and some people sort of like nature. We all have an embedded narrative in our head of what works. How do we make sure we're not fooling ourselves and we actually look at a lot of different things here, make sure we do what's needed, not what we just like to do?
If I just toss in like a big picture view of that, when we've been combining both philanthropy and venture and private investment together, and then we let things self-organize by topic, having the two together is really insightful in terms of what things are profitable, what not. Like all the ventures in one corner, that's in high-tech stuff, and then there's all the philanthropy fills the gap. But then you start to see where there's rare venture investments in a sea of philanthropy, where you're like, oh, there's maybe a new market there because the electric car theme 20 years ago was mostly grant funded, and then now all of a sudden it's a new thing. So it would have been like a scattering of little, investment dots in a lot of philanthropy dots. So I think sometimes just putting the different types of money together, you can start to see what's already really profitable to solve for profit maximizers, what is like maybe never going to be profitable to solve, and it requires really different approaches, and what is in the middle where there's actually some opportunities, but it's not currently there yet, but could use some nudge, and then it would, grow. So,
I mean, the thinking around the capital accelerator for Drawdown, you can kind of see this relationship between sectorally the sources of emissions versus where philanthropy, venture, later stage capital is being deployed. And what you see are some really outsized differences, and so part of the task there is to right-size the capital based on the sources of emissions. That's a really important principle. But then you can think about, I think, two things. One, policy also needs to be right-sized to the sources of emissions. So even the IRA, fantastic as it is actually over-indexed on energy and infrastructure, is under-indexed on building efficiency, for example. So we've got to get that right, because where we deploy our capital and pay our time and attention will actually matter the most if it's matched and right-sized to those sources of emissions. I think that's an important one to keep our eyes and ears on as additional policy comes online after we see things like the IRA, to make sure that we're addressing the problem in the right order and in the right size and scale by which it's being originated.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add that a tool we use is convening, and so just inviting different representatives from the different parts of the capital stack into the same room. We just convened a bunch of infrastructure investors and green banks and CDFIs, which is I don't think those two have talked much, and especially about investing in climate technology. And in fact, though, you have a lot of overlap in sort of desired outcomes, and I think sometimes it's just kind of hosting a convening where folks can get to know each other and share what they're working on and find those areas of mutual overlap.
Well, one last question. We have about 3 minutes left, too. This deserves a lot more time, but I'd love to hear a lot of the questions came in about how can we deploy climate solutions and climate technologies like this in ways that kind of don't exacerbate the difference between the global north and the global south, that really are thinking really across the whole spectrum of development across the world and improving human well-being and reducing tremendous international inequities. How do you all think about that big problem?
I have a simple thought on this, which is if you look at the emissions per capita of different countries around the world and their vulnerability to climate impacts, the people typically that have had the lowest emissions, someone in Bangladesh, for instance, has almost no lifetime emissions and is tremendously more vulnerable to climate change than those of us in the developing world, or in the developed world. We have air conditioning, we have aquifers, we have drip irrigation, whatnot. And so to me, solving climate change more quickly inherently is climate justice, because it's going to be led primarily by rich nations, and it has the greatest impact on those who live in some of the most vulnerable places in the world.
I would just add to that, sometimes in climate, you can solve a problem. There's a problem over here that you can solve elsewhere, right? They kind of offset each other. But in the immediate term, we really are going to have to go to where the emissions are coming from. And that's going to mean kind of getting to the basic infrastructure level, waste and energy. So that's going to be really important for us to keep our eyes and ears on. And I think the other thing is, you hear this in these large international gatherings, COP and what have you, UNGA is happening simultaneous to this conference. We have to start moving the funding from the global north that has more responsibility for our status quo to the global south that will also have to transition. It's a big conversation, but it's kind of, to me, it's a non-negotiable, right? We're not going to get there unless we really start getting towards the hundreds of billions of dollars necessary to do that work, and we're nowhere near close. So the answer of elected officials who really understand the problem is actually key, not just for our domestic approach, but is also key for how we approach internationally our responsibility to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Yeah, and I think it's actually in everybody's benefit, because if anything that improves livelihoods and climate resilience, globally, which is food security, water security, energy independence, health, et cetera, is the only way to prevent the largest forced displacement crisis in the history of human civilization that then has a million other cascading effects and supply chain disruptions and refugee crisis, whatever. So it's in everybody's interest to provide this whole new, it's a better world, that we're moving towards, and make that accessible to everybody and improve their livelihoods without, while reducing emissions, because it's the only way to prevent the other, adaptation crisis.
No, I think these guys did well.
Okay. Well, we have 7 seconds. We are on time. This is incredible. Oh, my God. Well, I want to thank our panel, because this is a really extraordinary group of people who think very deeply about climate philanthropy, climate investing. What we didn't want to do is just have the usual kind of, tech bros meeting finance bros on a stage somewhere selling you a lot of BS. We had a lot of that this week. But we didn't do that today. We have a lot of really thoughtful people who are thinking very deeply about what do we not know, and how do we really challenge ourselves to think more holistically across the capital stack, but also across equity and across community and across climate and biodiversity, really thinking deeply. And I think that's the challenge I'd leave us all with, is saying we need to think deeply and fast and together, otherwise we can't get this done. We have a window of opportunity to really address this crisis and actually build a better world as a result. But we have to make every move count, every dollar count. We have to stick the landing every single time, folks. And with, I think, people like this, we have a shot at it. And hopefully with all of you helping too. So thank you all very, very much for your time today. And thank you all so much for this great panel. Please give them a great hand.